when people come to therapy, particularly kind of older adolescents or young adults, they might be coming to say, I'm really stuck with this sense that I get in particular situations that might relate to feelings about ourselves or a lack of confidence or feelings of anxiety, perhaps. And when we start to unpack it, what we can often find is that some of these thoughts and feelings that might come up in people's current lives actually have been influenced by their past experiences. When we're traumatized, we no longer have access to those skills and those resources that we have that might have worked for us up to that point. So within trauma itself, we get a message that I'm overwhelmed. But then there's other forms of trauma as well, these ideas of these little t traumas, which are negative life experiences that might have a pattern to them over a period of time that can also teach us or give us messages about who we are or what the world is like that can influence then how we see and respond to the world around us.
Hello and welcome to another episode of This Complex Life. In today's episode, I chat with a colleague and a friend of mine, Katheryn Eberly, and we've been talking a lot about trauma and how our experiences of the past and memories and all these sorts of things can impact us day to day. So I thought we would have this chat on the podcast and share it with you all. So welcome to the podcast, Katheryn.
Thanks, Marie. It's really nice to be here and see you in this way.
Can you give the audience or the listeners just a little bit about you?
So I am a mental health social worker and a family therapist. I have been a social worker for, it's almost 20 years now, working in different ways, supporting children, young people and families. And the last few years I've been working more and more in private practice, supporting particularly children and young people and their families around understanding the impact of trauma and other difficult life circumstances on relationships and on mental health.
That's 20 years. Wow.
I know, not quite, but it's closer to 20 than any other decade or 5. So
I always get a bit alarmed when I go to update my resume and it just says like over X amount of years. I'm like, I'm just going to keep, there's this point where you want to sound like you're older and then other points you're like, no, not so much.
Yeah, 20. There's a big difference between 15 and 20, I think, but I'm just embracing it now.
Amazing. So we talk a lot about trauma and we'll maybe touch on that in just a moment, but how do you explain to people, or what do you notice around how our life experiences, often our negative ones, because, people don't come to therapy to say, I had this really positive experience with my parents and it's just really fueled my self-confidence and self-esteem. It's normally the less than ideal experiences or the things that we missed out on. How do those experiences shape our perception of the world?
I think it shapes it in different ways. I think often when people come to therapy, particularly kind of older adolescents or young adults, they might be coming to say, I'm really stuck with this idea. I'm really stuck with this sense that I get in particular situations that might relate to feelings about ourselves or a lack of confidence or feelings of anxiety, perhaps. And when we start to unpack it, what we can often find is that some of these thoughts and feelings that might come up in people's current lives actually have been influenced by their past experiences. And this often can connect to experiences that have left a mark on us in some way, which is kind of a way of understanding trauma and its impact on our lives. And there are different types of trauma and different forms of trauma in terms of how it affects us. We have these big, what they call kind of big T traumas, which are kind of big life events that can really be marked often by a day or a time and an incident that has happened. And they can really change our lives from that point onwards. And when we think about like what is trauma in terms of what is it and how does it affect us, it's our sense of being able to cope that gets totally overwhelmed, right? Like when you think about, what is good mental health and what is good kind of emotional well-being, it's really linked to our belief in our capacity to cope with what we're dealing with. That we know what we're feeling, we know why we're feeling it, and that we have a sense of being able to manage it, that we have the tools or the resources to be able to manage what we're experiencing. And when we experience trauma, part of the definition of trauma is that traumatic experiences overwhelm our capacity to cope. So then there's also other types of trauma, though, that are less kind of big, but they can also affect us in different ways. That's sometimes trickier to kind of pinpoint immediately, but they're often related to themes or experiences that we might have had over time as well.
Do you think, maybe I should have prepped you for this question, but do you think we use colloquially the word trauma a bit too flippant, like too freely? Like, oh my God, that was so traumatic. But what some people might really mean is that had an impact on me, or I was unhappy with that, or because I find the words trauma and triggering are being used in ways that is not really accurate. It's kind of been taken way out of context, which I feel like it minimizes some legitimate, serious impacts of trauma.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is used a lot in common talk around things being traumatic, or I was traumatized by this. And often what people really mean is I was really challenged, or I was really pushed outside of my comfort zone, or that was really upsetting. And I think in today's society, we are often discouraged from really sitting with our very strong negative emotions. And so sometimes if we're not used to having big, strong emotional reactions, we can feel traumatized in the moment. I'll use the word traumatized to kind of describe that feeling. But actually, when you think about what happened to you in that moment, it really comes down to, I think, your capacity to have managed and coped and sought support. So by coping, I mean either we're able to kind of work through that emotion in a way that we can get to the other side of it, that we're able to calm ourselves down, we're able to ask for help if we need help, or maybe we just need to cry or get upset and vent, and then we're fine. And then we kind of go back to where we were before the incident, and maybe we want to talk about it. But the difference, I think, with trauma in terms of what actually is happening in a person's nervous system is that it alters our nervous system response from that point on. Because when we are overwhelmed in a way that is really negative and makes us feel helpless or makes us feel unable to cope, we then learn something. And then the trauma response actually becomes what they call an adaptive response to something that we felt we couldn't deal with. And so our nervous system responses, the stress responses we have from that point onwards, it's kind of our body and our brain's way of alerting us that we never want to go through that again, that we cannot cope with that. And then from now on, we need to try not to be in a situation like that. And then we store, the trauma lives in our body in a way that then will make us very sensitive to any reminders of that. That kind of got a bit long-winded, but I think the difference is that, I think sometimes we say the word trauma, but what we really mean is that was really hard.
Yeah. So I think, that's a great topic for another episode, is just because we feel a difficult emotion doesn't mean it was traumatizing. It was difficult, frustrating, awkward, all those sorts of things. But when we're looking at trauma, especially those big T traumas, the physiological response it has on the nervous system, early current sort of imagery, brain scans is showing that it actually does rewire the way the brain functions, and it has an adapt afterwards to prevent that. And so what do you notice, like the ways in which people adapt? So, we talk sometimes about the fight, flight, freeze, or kind of fawn response. But what do you notice? What are some of the ways that those old memories or old experiences impact people currently?
Yeah. So I think what's important to know about our stress response system, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, is that it's there for a purpose. It's meant to be accessed. Just because we go into a fight, flight, freeze response doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. It's an adaptive response to a stressful situation. And because in those responses is where those tools, that I need to get out of here as quickly as possible, or I need to, fight my way out of this lion's den or whatever it is, they're there for a reason, but they're meant to be switched on and then switched off again. And when trauma occurs, it can rewire some of those responses to mean that they become activated either too much and too frequently or not enough, that our nervous system adapts to the idea that there is more threat than is actually real in what's happening around us. Or we become so accustomed to certain levels of risk or threat that we stop having those responses. And both of those can lead then to us having, I guess what you can kind of think about it as like disproportionate. So the responses to what is actually happening in the moment can sometimes be too big or too small to when you actually stop and kind of draw a line about what is it that's actually bothering me in this moment right now. Is all of that got to do with the way that I'm feeling now?
Would you give an example? Maybe not like we don't need to go into really complex trauma, but how might that show up in a workplace or in relationship with a friend or colleague?
Mm-hmm. Well, I had a client recently that I was working with, and she had been at the supermarket and had been interacting with a cashier who had been a little bit rude to her. And she found herself in a situation that she was quite upset about later, that she'd ended up kind of in an argument with this cashier about the cashier's kind of rudeness towards her. And she said she kind of ended up, feeling like she'd gotten into an argument with like a checkout person about something that was really not that important. And so she came and saw me a couple of weeks later and she said, I'm just really embarrassed that this had happened. And so we kind of talked about like, what was it that happened in that moment? And, what was it about that interaction that meant that you became so upset and triggered? And she said, it was the tone of voice and kind of that feeling of being dismissed. Like the question I'd asked had been not taken seriously, and she had asked a question about a price not being correct or something. And we were able to kind of talk through the fact that the emotional response that she had to feeling like the other person was not taking her question seriously was much more to do with some past experiences she'd had of feeling like if she was to ask a question of somebody who was the teacher or a parent, that she was made to feel like her questions weren't valid in some way, or that maybe it was saying something negative about her, that she didn't know all the answers. And she'd had a rough morning, she'd been sick for a few days before then and felt like in that moment that she didn't have all the resources to be able to just ignore it and walk away, that it really hit a nerve for her. And she wanted the checkout person to understand that, no, what I'm asking you is important. So I guess that's kind of an example of like an emotional reaction that doesn't quite fit the situation. And so I think that's always a sign that maybe there are some other things going on here that maybe are feeding into this moment, that you've had something happen in the past that's left a mark on you that it needs to be gone back to and looked at in terms of what is these negative experiences, what have they taught you, and caused you to kind of come to a belief that these ideas are true, even though they might not be true. These past experiences sometimes will teach us lessons that we assume are true about ourselves, like I'm not important, or I don't matter, or other people's needs are more important than mine.
Yeah, that it was a really nice segue, because I was going to ask you, how do we have a bit of a discussion around these idea of either core beliefs or core schemas or these different parts of ourselves? Like the language is used interchangeably and we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of the differences. But an earlier podcast episode did talk about this feeling of inadequacy and the not good enough. But you just mentioned some others, so not important enough, or my needs don't matter. What are some other ways that, and this is maybe where it gets tricky to understand this whole field of psychology and therapy, is trauma is not a diagnosis. You don't get diagnosed with trauma. You can be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or trauma can lead to anxiety, depression, any of the anxiety disorders, psychosis and eating disorder. So a traumatic event can actually be a trigger for a number of different mental illnesses. And all of these kind of core beliefs might not fit with a mental illness. So when we're thinking about core beliefs, what are some that you've kind of noticed, or maybe just one or two that you think would be helpful to kind of share with listeners?
Yeah, I think that's right, Marie, that core beliefs develop based on a multitude of life experiences that often have happened early in our lives. And, like we said before, there's different forms of trauma as well. So there's these big T's that overwhelm our capacity to cope. And often core beliefs that will come from those big experiences have to do with a sense of maybe there's something wrong with me, or I'm not able to cope, or that feeling of maybe I'm not safe, I always need to protect myself. Those kinds of beliefs might come from those bigger T traumas. But then there's other forms of trauma as well, these ideas of these little T traumas, which are negative life experiences that might have a pattern to them over a period of time that can also teach us or give us messages about who we are or what the world is like that can influence then how we see and respond to the world around us. And I think ones that I see a lot, I think, this idea that I don't matter. I think, particularly if children have grown up in situations maybe where things have been unpredictable or unstable, or they've had to in some way meet their own emotional needs sometimes, if maybe one or both of their parents have had other things going on in their lives that have affected their ability to really tune into what their children need. Children can sometimes get a sense that I don't matter, or I need to find a way to meet my own needs. I need to rely on myself. So I think those are common ones. I think as well, often in our field, I think a sense of a lot of people in our Western society have a real fear of failure. I think that our Western society doesn't look kindly on failure, and we can sort of internalize an idea that to fail is to be bad or that there's something wrong with us. And so I think lots of times people that I meet or that come into therapy sessions often will have really high standards for themselves, in terms of the way that they want to be able to live. But then underneath that is often a sense of failure when they can't meet their high standards. And that can come from a place of that fear that I'm not good enough or I'm a failure and failure is bad, rather than failure is really just, part of life, that we can't be good at everything. And sometimes we do well and sometimes we don't. But it's different than that idea. It's more of a sense of this is who I am underneath.
It's such an interesting point and I'll link to the episode, that I'm not good enough episode that I recently did about this. But how does that show up if we dig deep often, because it's something I see in my clients as well. It's like, well, I failed. Okay. And then what's your biggest fear? Oh, I'm not good enough. Okay. Then what's the biggest fear? When you dig deep, deep, deep down, I find that it's often I'm unlovable. That somehow if I get this wrong, if we follow that train of thought in far enough, and then people start to either get heartbroken that they never made that link, or it really cuts deep because all of that aspiration or achievement or perfection, all of that was to get one of our basic needs met, to feel connected, safety, security, to feel like we belong. How does that land with your experience or fit with
I
life?
think that's very true. I think we all, as humans, have a drive for connection and a drive to feel seen and heard and safe in relationship to other people. And when there have been things that have happened in our lives, either as children or as we've gotten older, that have gotten in the way of being able to have the security in a relationship where we feel connected and seen and understood, that particularly as children, I work a lot with children and I educate a lot of professionals around child development, and I work with, lots of parents and carers. And so when I say this, you kind of need to take it in context that children are very self-centered. They think they're the star of their own show because that's where their brain development is at, that it is the world is all about them when they're little. And as we grow up, we learn to kind of find our place in the world and how we relate to others. But very small children can only see the world through the eyes that they have. And they don't know or understand the intentions or the thoughts of adults. And so they will often internalize issues as being them being the star of the show, that in some way they are to blame, or there is something that they could have done differently that might have changed whatever happened in terms of whatever was going on in their family, or whatever an issue might have been in their life. And so these are things that get in the way sometimes of our sense of belonging, and also our sense of self-worth or self-value. I think that these little T traumas can happen, and sometimes that will happen in the family home. Sometimes that might happen at school, in the classroom, with teachers or with other peers, and then broader social experiences as we get older as well. But everybody wants to belong, and everyone wants to feel connected. And I think many people have that sense that if I don't have that, it's because there's something wrong with me. Rather than there are things that happen to me that sometimes get in the way of me being able to get the connection that I need with other people.
There's so much in it. Like, even when you're just talking about little kids, I felt that emotional response that, like, you just want to scoop them up and tell them it's not your fault, but they would rather be like, it's not that they prefer it, but it's developmentally appropriate to think, if something happens, it's not because my parents weren't able to love me, it's because I was unlovable. It's not that my parents were busy, it's because they didn't want to spend time with me. And that's where the brain development is you are the center of your own world, and you literally need them to stay alive. So you interpret your surroundings based on that.
Yeah. And this is how these core beliefs or these schemas or these ways of seeing the world, they form when we're quite young, and usually just based on the experiences that we're having in the context of our little lives when we're small. And I think it's important to say as well that everyone has a version of this. Like, no family is perfect, no parent is perfect. Everyone is going to have their own version of what's gone well and what they feel they might have had better in their childhood, or the beliefs they might have developed about themselves based on the type of parenting they received. And so I think it's important to say there's nothing wrong with you just because sometimes you think there's something wrong with you, that everyone has a version of that I've ever met. I don't know about you, but I've never met anybody in the world who doesn't have some form of insecurity about themselves sometime.
I don't know what you mean. No, of course. Like, I think it's, and maybe that lets people off the hook a little bit, right? Because I know a lot of parents listen to consume all this content and think, great, that's just another thing that I'm not doing good enough, is being good enough for my kids. And so that's a whole other thing. But, it is, we're shaped by our experiences. And I think of, plants or vines or something, they kind of maneuver and they grow around whatever debris is there, or they'll grow around a tree or a building. Like, we move and adapt.
Yes. And I think what's important to remember about trauma is that almost always, if you think the definition of trauma is our capacity to cope is being overwhelmed, that there is a sense of I can't cope with this because I wouldn't be traumatized by it if I could cope with it. It's throwing out of balance everything we kind of believe to be true about ourselves, which is I can cope, or I do have the resources to manage, or I have people around me who will support me. When we're traumatized, we no longer have access to those skills and those resources that we have that might have worked for us up to that point. So within trauma itself, we get a message that I'm overwhelmed, and we're also often made to feel helpless or hurt or out of control or unsafe. And so always there will be this sense after trauma of a negative self-belief that becomes kind of embedded in our system, that then is also connected to these nervous system stress responses that lead us to kind of feeling anxious, feeling reactive, or feeling avoidant, or feeling numb and shut off. They will often also have with them a sense of a belief about ourselves of not being good enough, or not feeling safe, or not feeling like we matter. And I guess, thinking about the clients that we work with and maybe the people who might listen to a podcast like this, I guess it's kind of understanding, like, when is that just kind of normal life, and when is that actually getting in the way? When are my reactions like, the person in the supermarket when is my capacity to cope with what feels like everyday situations not working for me? And does that have something to do with things that have happened to me in the past that are getting in the way of me being able to live the life that I want to live now?
So how do people, like, where can they start? Where can they differentiate that?
Yeah, I think it comes down to kind of our ability to, again, know, what am I feeling in this moment when maybe I'm feeling a bit stressed or nervous or uncertain? What am I feeling? And then why am I feeling it? And then do I have the ability to cope with it in this moment? First of all, we need to have a sense of understanding our own feelings and why do we feel the way we feel. And then I think if we realize that sometimes the way that I feel, if I was to, like, again, draw a circle around this experience, this moment that right now I'm feeling frustrated. I've gone to the supermarket. Like I went this morning to the supermarket and the one thing that I needed to buy was out of stock. So then it's really annoying, right? Because then I have to plan the rest of my day around, do I need to go to a different supermarket or do I just not have now the almond milk that I need for this thing that I'm making? And so in that moment, I'm annoyed, right? And so when we kind of catch these negative emotions, it's kind of saying right, how much of this has to do with what's going on right now? I'm annoyed because now I've wasted my time. I'm going to have to go look for other things at a different supermarket. That's going to waste an hour of my day. I don't have that much time. And that's why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. But I kind of can say to myself, yeah, all right, well, I know what I need to do about this. I just need to go home. I just need to get on with things and I'll sort that problem out later. But then when I think about what else contributes to the feeling that I have in that moment, there's also anxiety about if I don't get that cake made, I won't be able to take it to that thing that I'm going to tomorrow. And then maybe someone will be disappointed in me. And then that might bring up a feeling of I don't want to disappoint the person that I'm making the cake for, right? And still, maybe I know how to deal with that, but maybe then I've had other experiences. Maybe this is a relationship where we've had conflict or we've had issues around letting each other down before, so you can start to kind of unpack and understand that when I feel annoyed in the supermarket about the milk not being there, sometimes my emotions actually have more to do with what I think is going to happen next or what might have happened in the past. And I think as we kind of get to know ourselves through processes of therapy or reading books or just kind of spending time understanding our emotional responses, sometimes we can start to see patterns that, often when I'm in this type of situation, I tend to have the same response, the same part of me seems to get activated that I'm worried about letting a person down and what that might mean. And I wonder where that's come from and why am I so worried about letting people down? So that's kind of an example, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good one because that same example, it could be the thing that you fear could be on a number of different things depending on your experiences. So if you had a feeling of, see, I can never get it right. I know, see what a classic me, I'm so disorganized. That could be the train of thought. Or it could be, see, this is just another example of how I'm a crappy parent. I can't get anything right. So something as simple as something you couldn't control, like the supermarket not having the thing you needed, could be a floodgate of self-doubt and
Yes.
criticism.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's three things going on at once. There's what's going on in the moment. And do I know how to manage that in the moment? But also, what am I afraid of happening? But also, what is this reminding me of? This feeling, if I sit with this feeling, when have I felt it before? And that's just something that I'll often do kind of in therapy sessions, with people. It's when they're coming to me saying, this is what's causing me a problem. I have this emotional reaction that I find, hard to understand or I get stuck with or I'm embarrassed by when I have this reaction in public. Often what I'm really curious about is where have you felt this feeling before? If it was such a strong response in the moment, let's understand the history of that feeling and where did you experience it before? And what is it connected to? And often, in our work, what we start to understand is it's often got to do with past experiences that have impacted us in some ways. And the more we understand why these feelings come up, the more options we have in terms of responding to them or managing them or processing them in a way that stops them impacting us so strongly in the present.
I love that. And the family therapy bit of me is thinking it's so interesting then how people respond to something like that. So if this was you and you were fretting about the ingredient missing and you were venting to your partner, but in your head there was this big cascading fear of letting your friend down, being disappointed, blah, blah, blah. And he's just, oh, well, big deal, just make something else. That would be like crushing and invalidating. And that could then turn into a fight or conflict. And neither do you have any idea what just happened. Like you might look back at that and he's like, it's just, kind of vanilla essence or whatever it was that was missing. And you're coming from a place of like either fury or pain or something else. And then it has these impacts on relationships.
Yeah. Yes. And our sense of, again, feeling connected to and understood by other people. And yeah, it can get in the way because what you kind of need in that moment isn't understood by the other person, but partly because we don't necessarily understand it ourselves in terms of what it is that we are really feeling and why we need that from the other person as well.
So where do we start? So, where can, listeners that might be struggling with this, or maybe they're resonating with something that you've said or that we've discussed today, and they're thinking, oh, I didn't realize my response might be disproportionate to this event, or yeah, I do seem to have these things pop up at work or with relationships. Where can they go or what can they do to start to understand this a bit more about themselves?
Yeah. I mean, I think partly it starts with that practice of really tuning into noticing what we feel and when we feel it. And there's lots of different practices that we can make use of that can help us just to even get in the habit of paying attention to our feelings and understanding, that our feelings are like the weather, right? Like they come and go. And part of our practice is just kind of paying attention to what happens when we feel certain things and in what context we feel them. And so, I guess understanding how do we start to tune into what's going on inside us without judgment or without getting too worried about the different things we think and feel. And so, some of the ideas in acceptance and commitment therapy, I think if you look up kind of some of the principles around those ideas, there are some really nice exercises that are really straightforward, that you don't need to go to a therapy session to be able to understand how do I tune into my thoughts and emotions and start to understand what's happening inside me. Because then I think from there, once we are able to do that, then we can start to pay attention to, are there patterns? Are there times when I really seem to get really upset or really kind of triggered in some way that feels outside of my control? Because if we notice those patterns, I guess those are the times that maybe we need to dig a little bit deeper. And maybe that's looking into, I guess, therapies that might help us to really kind of connect the dots between our emotional responses in the present and how they might have be impacted by what's happened in the past. And sometimes that's work we can do on our own, and sometimes that is work that we need to go and see, a professional who's trained in therapies that help us to do that. And some of those therapies would be schema therapy or EMDR therapy or therapies that include an internal family systems approach, among others.
Yeah, that's awesome. And people can come see us.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Come and have a chat with us. We love to have a chat. Any particular, just before we kind of wrap up, like books or website, anything that someone can kind of go to that you might think, oh, this would be a helpful place?
Yeah.
I know in past episodes I've talked about like self-compassion. I think that can be a really good one if you're going to dig into some of this, is do some self-compassion work, and Kristin Neff's resources for that are amazing. The Brene Brown books, I think I'm just looking at the stack of books behind me, come to mind. Any things that you reckon?
Bruce Perry has some really fantastic books about understanding the impacts of childhood trauma. And he and Oprah have a book called What Happened to You.
Oh my God, it's such a good book.
It's a great book, and I would really recommend listening to the audiobook actually if you can, because it's Oprah and Bruce having a conversation. And I really liked that book for myself, but I know a lot of clients and colleagues that also really found that book so helpful to think about how do our past experiences impact us and what are the connections, and even Oprah Winfrey had some aha moments, I think, in the writing of this book. So yeah, that's one I would really recommend. I think books by, I'm looking now at my stack of books on my shelf trying to read. I think Janina Fisher has some really interesting information that you probably just be able to Google some of her stuff, and Deb Dana as well, in terms of understanding the impact of traumatic experiences on our nervous systems and how we might be able to tune into our bodies to help us understand where our feelings come from. Yeah, those are the ones that kind of come to mind.
I think the Bruce Perry one, people can't see this because it's audio, but I was like smiling and nodding in front because that's a brilliant book. I think I listened to it on a big kind of interstate drive, and it's so well written. And for those who are thinking, oh goodness, Oprah, what?
I know, and I felt that too. I was like, oh no, I can't listen to a book that's got Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah, that I can't marry that in my mind. But honestly, it's one of the best reads or listens on the impact of trauma that I've ever listened.
I love it. That has probably been one of the most life-changing books that I recommend to clients, that and Lost Connections. I'm going to put that in the notes as well. Awesome. Thanks so much, Katheryn. I hope people find this helpful and can start to explore themselves a little bit more, and, maybe the takeaway is to be curious, not critical, and start to notice your emotions.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we live in a world where that's not given enough space. And so I think if that's the one thing that we can take away, it is just get comfortable with paying attention to how you're feeling, because our bodies are amazing and they'll communicate so much to us if we make the space.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep the conversation going, head on over to Instagram or LinkedIn and follow me. If you'd like to keep updated with episodes and other interesting things happening in mental health, join my weekly This Complex Life newsletter, where I'll share tools, tips and insight. There's a link in the show notes. Got a question you want answered? Shoot me an email or a DM. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy the show, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a rating and a review. It helps other people find the podcast.